All right, Cloud Warriors, if you are gearing up for that CCSP exam, they're going to throw some serious risk assessment questions your way.
Mm-hmm.
And let's face it, in the cloud, risk is like that extra shot of espresso.
Yeah.
It's always there.
It really is the heart of cloud security, isn't it? Because unlike that old server room down the hall, the cloud is constantly shifting.
Exactly. We're
Yeah.
talking about a whole ecosystem of services, infrastructure, and providers, a security juggler's nightmare.
Right.
But fear not, because in this deep dive, we're going to break down the key concepts you need to ace that exam and become a true cloud risk ninja.
Absolutely. Let's start with the fundamentals. It's like building a house. You need a solid foundation.
Okay.
And in risk assessment, that foundation is understanding the core terminology.
Okay, so let's talk definitions. What's the difference between a threat, a vulnerability, and a risk?
They're all bad.
They're all important pieces of the puzzle, but they have distinct meanings.
What?
Think of a threat as anything that could potentially harm your cloud environment.
It could be a hacker group, a natural disaster, even a simple misconfiguration.
So the threat is the potential bad guy lurking out there in the digital shadows. What about vulnerability?
A vulnerability is a weakness that makes your system susceptible to those threats.
Okay.
It's like a crack in your defenses that a threat could exploit. Imagine you left your cloud storage bucket wide open for anyone to access.
Right.
That's a vulnerability.
And I'm guessing that's where risk comes into play. The possibility that a threat will actually take advantage of that vulnerability.
You nailed it. Risk is the likelihood that a specific threat will exploit a specific vulnerability, leading to a negative impact. So in your open storage bucket example, the risk would be a hacker finding it and stealing your data.
Ouch. Not good. Okay, so now that we have our vocabulary sorted, how does all of this play out in the cloud? It's not like we can just build a wall around our data center anymore.
Right. It's much more complex. In the cloud, we have workloads spread across multiple providers, different types of services, and even some on-premise systems still in the mix. Each piece has its own potential vulnerabilities and attracts different types of threats.
It's like trying to secure a city with neighborhoods, skyscrapers, and underground tunnels all interconnected and with different levels of security needed.
A perfect analogy. That's why assessing risk in the cloud requires a multi-layered approach. We need to consider the security posture of each provider, the configurations of our services, and how they all interact. It's a dynamic puzzle constantly changing.
So how do we even begin to assess risk in such a complex environment?
There are two main approaches, qualitative and quantitative.
Okay.
Qualitative assessment is like a detective using their experience and judgment to evaluate risks. It's about understanding the nature of the threats and vulnerabilities and making an informed estimate of the potential impact.
So it's like a seasoned investigator using their intuition and knowledge to size up a situation.
Exactly. But sometimes we need more than intuition. That's where quantitative risk assessment comes in. It's all about assigning numbers to those risks, calculating the potential financial impact if something goes wrong.
So we're talking spreadsheets, formulas, and putting a dollar value on those potential headaches.
Precisely. Quantitative risk assessment helps us prioritize risks based on their potential financial impact, which can be a huge help when it comes to making decisions about security investments.
Okay, so quantitative sounds pretty powerful.
Yeah.
But where do we even start with all these calculations?
The core of quantitative risk assessment is understanding a few key variables. First, we have asset value, the financial worth of what we're trying to protect. This could be a database, a server, or even the reputation of your company.
So you're literally putting a price tag on everything.
Right.
What happens if that price tag is hard to pin down, like with something like brand reputation?
It can get tricky.
Yeah.
You might need to consider factors like the cost of rebuilding customer trust or the potential loss of revenue if your reputation is damaged. It's not always a simple calculation, but it's important to have some kind of estimate.
Fair enough. So we've got our asset value. What's next?
Then we have the exposure factor, the percentage of that asset that would be affected if a particular risk were to occur. Imagine a data breach. Would it impact all your customer data or just a portion of it?
Okay, so if only 10% of our data is at risk in a particular scenario, that would be a much smaller exposure factor than if it were 100%.
Exactly. Now, by multiplying the asset value by the exposure factor, we arrive at the single loss expectancy, or SLE. This tells us the potential financial hit we could take from a single incident.
So if our data is worth $1 million and the exposure factor for a certain breach is 20%, our SLE for that scenario would be $200,000.
Ouch.
You got it.
Yeah.
But keep in mind, that's just the potential cost of one incident. To understand the bigger picture, we need to factor in how often that risk might rear its ugly head.
That makes sense. Some risks might be more frequent than others. How do we calculate that?
That's where the annualized rate of occurrence, or ARO, comes in.
It's an estimate of how many times we expect that risk to happen in a year. This is where historical data industry trends and even a bit of educated guessing come into play.
So if we think that a particular type of breach might happen once every 5 years, our ARO would be zero point 0.2.
Exactly. And now for the grand finale, we multiply the SLE by the ARO to get the annualized loss expectancy, or ALE.
Okay, so ALE is the big one.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us a yearly estimate of the financial impact of that risk.
Precisely. In your example, with an SLE of $200,000 and an ARO of zero point 0.2, the ALE would be $40,000.
Yep.
That's the average financial hit you can expect from that risk each year.
Wow, that's a lot of number crunching.
Yep.
But I can see how understanding these calculations can help prioritize risks and make informed decisions about security investments.
You're starting to think like a true cloud security professional.
Okay.
But remember, risk assessment isn't just about numbers. We also need to consider the time it takes to recover from an incident.
That makes sense. Downtime can be just as costly as a data breach, especially in the cloud where everything is always on.
Absolutely. We need to think about metrics like mean time to failure, MTTF, for non-repairable assets.
Okay.
Mean time between failures, MTBF, for things that can be fixed.
Okay.
And most importantly, mean time to repair, MTTR, how long it takes to get back on our feet. These are all crucial for understanding the potential impact of a disruption.
And I'm betting these metrics play a big role in those service level agreements, SLAs, we always hear about with cloud providers.
You are so right. Knowing these metrics can help you evaluate different providers and ensure your chosen services meet your recovery time objectives.
This is all starting to click.
Yeah.
I'm feeling way more confident about tackling risk assessment, both on the exam and in my future cloud career.
That's what we like to hear. But before we get too comfortable with all these numbers, it's important to remember that quantitative risk assessment has its limitations. There are some aspects of risk that just don't fit neatly into a spreadsheet.
Ooh, I like where this is going. You're about to drop some wisdom bombs on us, aren't you?
Let's just say there's more to risk than meets the calculator.
Welcome back, risk takers. Ready to dive even deeper into the world of cloud security risk.
Absolutely. We left off with a bit of a cliffhanger, talking about the limitations of purely quantitative risk assessment.
Yeah, you really got us thinking with that one.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the numbers.
Right.
But what about those risks that are harder to measure?
Mm-hmm.
The ones that don't fit neatly into a formula.
Exactly. Things like reputational damage. You can't always put a precise dollar amount on a tarnished reputation,
Right.
but the impact can be absolutely devastating.
It's like that saying, a reputation takes a lifetime to build and a moment to destroy.
Yeah.
In the age of social media, a single security incident can go viral and damage your brand in the blink of an eye.
That's a great point. And it highlights the need to consider qualitative factors in our risk assessments.
Right.
Even if we can't precisely quantify the financial impact of reputational damage, we can still assess its potential severity and take steps to mitigate that risk.
So it's about thinking beyond the spreadsheet and considering the broader impact on the business. What other qualitative risks should we be thinking about?
Well, there's the ever-present human factor. We can implement all the security controls in the world, but human error is always a possibility.
Oh, I know that feeling. We've all accidentally clicked on a phishing link or misconfigured a setting at some point.
Exactly. And those seemingly small mistakes can have huge consequences in the cloud. A misconfigured firewall rule, an accidental data deletion, or even just poor password hygiene can open the door to a major security breach.
It's a constant battle against human fallibility.
It is.
So how do we account for this unpredictable element in our risk assessments?
We need to acknowledge that human error is a part of life and design our systems and processes with resilience in mind.
Okay.
Think about things like multi-factor authentication, robust access controls, and thorough security awareness training. We can't prevent every mistake,
Right.
but we can minimize the impact when they do occur.
It's about building in those safety nets to catch those inevitable human slip-ups. So we've got reputational damage and human error. Any other tricky risks lurking out there?
There's the whole world of third-party risk. In the cloud, we rely on so many external vendors and service providers.
Right.
Each one adds another layer of complexity to our risk landscape.
It's like inviting a bunch of friends over for a party. You never know who might accidentally spill something on the carpet.
That's a great analogy. You have to carefully vet your vendors,
Yeah.
understand their security practices, and make sure they align with your own risk tolerance.
So it's not enough to just secure your own environment. You have to think about the security posture of your entire cloud ecosystem.
Exactly. And then there's the question of emerging technologies. The cloud is constantly evolving with new services and technologies popping up all the time.
It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Mm.
How do we even begin to assess the risks associated with technologies that are still being developed?
It requires a proactive approach. We need to stay informed about the latest trends, carefully evaluate new technologies before adopting them, and constantly update our risk assessments to account for these changes.
It sounds like risk assessment in the cloud is an ongoing journey, not a one-time destination.
You're absolutely right. It's a continuous process of identifying, evaluating, and managing risks. And it requires a combination of quantitative analysis, qualitative judgment, and a healthy dose of adaptability.
This is really starting to make sense. But there's one piece of the puzzle that I'm still not quite clear on. How do we decide how much risk is too much? It's like that old saying, no risk, no reward.
That's a great question. It brings us to the concept of risk appetite. Every organization has a different level of risk they're willing to accept in pursuit of their objectives.
So some organizations might be more risk averse, while others are willing to push the boundaries a bit more.
Exactly. A startup trying to disrupt the market might be willing to take on more risk than a large financial institution that prioritizes stability above all else.
Right.
It all depends on the specific circumstances and goals of the organization.
So how do we figure out our organization's risk appetite? Do we just throw darts at a board and hope for the best?
It's a bit more strategic than that. It starts with a conversation. You need to involve key stakeholders, from business leaders to security experts,
Okay.
to understand their perspectives on risk and what they're comfortable with.
So it's about aligning security with business goals.
Precisely. And once you have a clear understanding of your risk appetite, you can use it as a guiding principle for your risk assessments and your overall security strategy.
This is all starting to click.
Mm-hmm.
I'm feeling way more confident about tackling risk assessment, both on the exam and in my future cloud career.
That's great to hear.
But I can see how overwhelming it can be for someone just starting out.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much to learn.
You're absolutely right. And that's why it's so important to break it down into manageable chunks.
Okay.
We've talked about a lot of different concepts today, but let's focus on one key takeaway.
Right.
Risk assessment is about making informed decisions.
That's a great point. It's not just about running calculations or checking boxes. It's about understanding the threats, the vulnerabilities, and the potential impact on your organization. It's about weighing the costs and benefits of different security measures.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, it's about making choices that balance security with business objectives.
Well said. And one of the most important decisions you'll make is how to classify your data. Because let's face it, not all data is created equal.
You're telling me my cat videos are definitely not as sensitive as, say, customer financial information.
Exactly. And that's why data classification is so crucial.
Okay.
By categorizing data based on its sensitivity and value,
Right.
we can determine the appropriate level of protection it needs.
So we wouldn't necessarily need the same level of security for those cat videos as we would for sensitive customer data.
Precisely. Data classification helps us prioritize our security efforts and allocate resources effectively.
Oh.
We can focus our strongest defenses on protecting the most valuable assets.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like building a fortress. You want the strongest walls around the most important treasures. But how do we actually go about classifying data? Is there a standard system, or do we just make it up as we go along?
There are established frameworks and best practices you can follow, but ultimately it depends on your organization's specific needs and the types of data you handle.
So it's about finding the right balance between following those best practices and customizing them to fit your unique situation.
Exactly. And remember, data classification is not a one-time task.
Right.
It's an ongoing process that needs to be revisited and updated as your data changes and new threats emerge.
It's like keeping your security playbook up to date, constantly adapting to the changing game.
Well said. And speaking of adapting, there's another crucial aspect of risk management we need to address.
Okay.
Risk response.
Right.
What do we do once we've identified those risks?
This is the part where we actually take action, right? It's time to put those risk management muscles to work.
You got it. Risk response is all about having a plan in place for how you'll address those identified risks. And there are 4 primary strategies to choose from: avoidance, mitigation, transference, and acceptance.
Okay, let's break those down. Avoidance sounds pretty straightforward. If something is too risky, just don't do it.
That's the essence of avoidance. If a particular activity or technology poses an unacceptable level of risk,
Right.
you might choose to avoid it altogether. Maybe you decide not to store certain types of sensitive data in the cloud, or you opt for a more secure alternative.
It's like saying, nope, not worth the risk.
Mm-hmm.
What about mitigation? That sounds like trying to reduce the risk somehow.
Exactly. Mitigation is about implementing security controls to reduce the likelihood or impact of a risk. This could include things like encryption to protect sensitive data, multi-factor authentication to strengthen access controls, or intrusion detection systems to alert you to suspicious activity.
It's about putting up those guardrails to keep things running smoothly. What about transference? Does that mean passing the risk buck to someone else?
That's the idea. Transference involves shifting the risk to a third party. A classic example is cyber insurance. You're essentially paying someone else to assume the financial burden of a potential security incident.
So it's like outsourcing the risk management. And finally, we have acceptance. Does that mean just throwing your hands up and saying, whatever happens, happens?
Not exactly. Acceptance is a conscious decision to accept a certain level of risk,
Okay.
often because the cost of implementing other response strategies outweighs the potential impact of the risk itself. It's a calculated decision, not a surrender.
So it's a strategic choice, not just giving up.
Precisely. You're acknowledging the risk, understanding its potential impact, and deciding that it's within your organization's risk tolerance.
Welcome back, Cloud Explorers. We are wrapping up our risk assessment deep dive with some key concepts to help you lock in those CCSP concepts.
And just as importantly, to make you a more confident and savvy cloud security pro in the real world.
Last time we talked about those 4 risk response strategies: avoidance, mitigation, transference, and acceptance. It's like having a security playbook for different risk scenarios. But before we get too strategic, let's circle back to something fundamental: data classification.
You are right. It all starts with understanding the value and sensitivity of the data you're entrusted with, because a one-size-fits-all security approach just won't cut it in the cloud.
It's like protecting a castle. You don't need a moat and drawbridge around the kitchen garden.
Right.
But how do we go beyond the analogy and actually implement data classification in a cloud environment?
Think of it as creating a hierarchy of data sensitivity. You might have categories like public internal, only confidential, and top secret.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we are sorting our data into different levels of importance.
Yeah.
But then how does this classification actually translate into security measures?
That's where system categorization comes in. It's about aligning the protection level of a system with the classification of the data it handles.
So if a system stores top secret customer financial data, it needs a lot more security firepower than one that just manages publicly available product information.
Exactly. Higher impact systems require more stringent controls. Think robust access controls, encryption both in transit and at rest, frequent security audits, and even physical security measures if needed.
It's about making sure the security measures are proportionate to the potential consequences of a breach. But this must get pretty complicated when we're talking about complex cloud environments with so many interconnected systems.
It absolutely does. You might have data flowing between multiple cloud services, on-premises systems, and third-party applications.
So it's not enough to just classify the data itself. We need to understand how it moves and where it's processed to ensure consistent protection across the entire data lifecycle.
You are thinking like a true security architect, and that's a crucial skill for anyone working in the cloud.
But let's be realistic. Keeping track of all these systems and classifications in a dynamic cloud environment sounds like a full-time job.
It definitely requires diligence and a systematic approach, but luckily there are tools and technologies to help us automate and manage this process. Think data loss prevention, DLP solutions, cloud security posture management, CSPM tools, and even good old-fashioned documentation and governance frameworks.
Okay, so we have ways to keep our security house in order. But even with the best tools and practices, things can still go wrong, right?
Yeah.
What happens when, despite our best efforts, a risk actually materializes?
That's when our incident response plan kicks into gear. Having a well-rehearsed plan is crucial for minimizing the impact of a security incident and getting back on track quickly.
So it's not just about preventing bad things from happening. It's about knowing what to do when they inevitably do.
Exactly. A solid incident response plan outlines roles and responsibilities, communication protocols, escalation procedures, and forensic investigation steps.
It's like having a fire drill for your cloud environment.
That's a great way to think about it. You want to
Yeah.
practice those procedures regularly so everyone knows what to do when the alarm bells start ringing.
This has been an incredible journey, hasn't it? We have covered so much ground, from the basic definitions to the complex calculations and the strategic decision-making involved in risk management.
We really have, and I hope our listeners are feeling empowered to tackle those CCSP exam questions and to approach cloud security risk with a new level of confidence.
I know I am. But before we sign off, what's one key piece of advice you would give to someone embarking on their cloud security career?
Never stop learning. The cloud is constantly evolving with new threats and technologies emerging all the time. Stay curious, embrace continuous learning, and never underestimate the power of collaboration and community.
Wise words. And on that note, we are signing off on this risk assessment deep dive. But remember, this is just the beginning of your cloud security journey. Keep exploring, keep challenging yourself, and keep those cloud skills sharp. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the exciting world of technology. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious, cloud champions.